Mr. Jalas. Our next speaker is Professor Emad Khalil of Maritime Archaeology from Alexandria University and will speak about the Navy of Ptolemaic Alexandria.
Good morning, everyone. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, first of all, and to see so many familiar faces. And thank for the organizers of the event and for inviting me to be a part of this magnificent conference. And this presentation will be looking at the Egyptian naval forces, this distribution and formation during the early Ptolemaic period. And it's most likely that it's going to raise questions more than it will provide answers, so don't be hopeful for a lot of answers in this presentation. It is evident that after the death of Alexander the Great in 223 BC, and his kingdom was soon divided among his commanders, and it took the form of several competing and conflicting states. However, the relationship between the Hellenistic kingdoms was quite dynamic, which resulted in constant changes in the extent and limits of those kingdoms. During the first 3 decades, the Ptolemies has occasional conflicts with their neighbors all the time, competing over territories. And especially, one of the main concerns were the Levantine coast. So accordingly, the eastern borders of the Ptolemaic kingdom was, in sense, changing all the time during this conflict. And one of the main reasons the conflict took part along the Levantine coast was competing over accessibility to shipbuilding timbers, which were scarce in Egypt, as we know. During the early time of Ptolemy II, Philadelphus, the Ptolemaic kingdom reached its greatest extent, extending west as far as Bernike or Beni Ghazi in Libya now, and extending north as far as Byblos or Jbeil in Lebanon. Also, the Ptolemies were controlling several islands, including Cyprus and a number of islands in the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. And in order to manage and control this extensive region, the Ptolemies created one of the largest fleets known in antiquity. From the 1st century AD, we have Appian of Alexandria speaking about the navy of the Ptolemies. He states that the naval forces the Ptolemies had, consisted of 2,000 barges propelled by poles and other small crafts, 1,500 galleys from 1.5, which is a type of warship, hemiolia, to the 5s, which is another type of warship. We'll talk about this later. So between the 1.5 and the 5, those 2 types of warships, or the Penterace, and warships gear or supplies for warship for twice that number. Also, the Ptolemies had 800 cabin boats or cabin ships, thalamigoi, gilded on stem and rams, on board which the kings themselves went to naval combats. So this is Appian's statement about the Ptolemaic navy or the Ptolemaic fleet. Appian is speaking about a total of 4,300 ships of different types, including hemiolia, which is a well-known type of double-banked warship, and 5s, Penterace, which were probably triple-banked, 3 levels. We'll talk about this in a minute. And thalamigoi, and this, which is a bit interesting, very interesting. Cabin boats, boats with cabins on them, which seems to be a more elaborate type of warships because it was used by the kings when they went to war or as flagships. The cabin boats or the thalamigoi was mentioned earlier by Strabo in his testimony about Egypt when he spoke of Skydia, the suburb of Alexandria. And he states that in Skydia, there is a station or a harbor for vessels with cabins, ton thalamigo and ploion, which carry the governors when they visit Upper Egypt. So there was a base or a naval base in Skydia, specially dedicated to this type of warships or the Thalamigoi. It is certain then that warships in the Ptolemaic fleet, and even later on, they were functioning on both the sea and the Nile. So they had both stations or harbors for warships on the Nile as well as on the Mediterranean Sea. Probably the most detailed description ever we have of the Ptolemaic fleet comes from Athenaios of Naucratis. He speaks of the fleet of King Ptolemy II, which was greater in number than all other fleets of that time. This is Athenaios' statement, and Athenaios clearly states that he is listing the largest types of ships in that fleet, not all the types. So it's clear from his statement that he's talking about the largest types rather than the entire fleet. So he says that Ptolemy II fleet consisted of 2 30s. So 2 ships, this is the quantity, and 30s is the type of the ship. 2 30s, and 120, 4 13s, 2 12s, 14 11s, 39s, 36 7s, 5 6s, 17 5s, and from the 4s all the way down to the half-bank triremes or the tremiolia, he had twice as many as all these together. So he's talking about a number, quantities, and types. 2 or 1 or 4 or 3 or 36, these are the quantities, and then we have the 20s and 30s and 12s and 11s, these are the types. So what we have here is 2 times 111 ships, which is a total of 222 ships. In addition to that, according to Athenaios again, Ptolemy had more vessels which were sent to different islands and to other cities under his dominion and to the Libya, and those were about 4,000 ships. So he had 222 and 4,000. And this is very close to what Appian said earlier, 4,300, and here we have 4,222, so it's very, very, very close. However, Appian was not very clear about the types of the ships, but here it is very detailed, how many ships of what type. However, we are definitely talking about a fleet of more than 4,000 warships. The majority of which, however, were not stationed in Egypt, but were stationed elsewhere, in the Mediterranean, in territories under the control of the Ptolemies. But the Egyptian fleet based in Egypt was much lesser and was not more than 300 ships to the most. Obviously, there is the ever contradictionally and controversially issue about what does the type of ships mean. We have Harry Zallas here who knows a lot about this. We have Alec Tilley in the audience who knows about this. But there are different theories about what is a 30 and what is a 17 and what is a 5, and there's a lot of debate about. However, the majority of scholars, except Alec Tilley down there, agrees or believes that the number of the type of the ship reflects the number of oarsmen or people rowing on one side of the ship. So, for example, a 6 could be, a 6 like this one, could be a ship with 3 levels and 2 oarsmen on each oar. Or a ship with 2 levels and 3 oarsmen on each oar. So it's either this or that. It could be a 6. I mean, this is one theory. Or a 12, for example, could be a ship with 3 levels, 3 files, and 4 oarsmen on each oar. However, I won't spend too much time on this. This is not the main issue. But what I need to focus on is that the Ptolemies kept the majority of their fleet, 4,000 ships, in territories outside Egypt, while they kept more or less 300 ships in Egypt. Based on numerous historical events about the different Hellenistic fleets in the Mediterranean, it is believed that no ship larger than a 10 or decuirace is known to have fought in battles. So all ships rather than larger than 10s were mostly used for processions, for ceremonies, for celebrations, to carry the kings and queens around, but not actually fighting ships. Ships lower in size than the 10s were normally fighting warships. And by looking at the Ptolemaic fleet formation, it is noticed that the majority of ships which were based in Egypt were smaller than a 10. So we have the 9s and 7s and 6s and 5s, which are all smaller than a 10, and these account for 310 ships out of 333. So 93% of the ships in the Ptolemaic fleet were fighting ships, while 7% only were larger than a 10, and they were procession ships. So we have two separate groups of warships within the same fleet of the Ptolemies, of the early Ptolemies. And it's very likely that the royal ships, the 7%, the ones which are larger than the 10s, were kept closer to the royal palaces, the vicinity of the royal courtyard of the Ptolemies. However, where did the Ptolemies keep their 333 ships that was retained in Egypt? We don't really have any direct evidence on that. However, it is known, for example, that during the war of Julius Caesar that waged on Alexandria in 48 BC, and after he burned most of the Egyptian fleet in the great harbor of Alexandria, the Egyptians, this according to Julius Caesar's testimony, the Egyptians were able to recall 22 ships of the type known as the quadriremes or the fours, which were based at that time at the mouth of the Nile, guarding the mouth of the Nile. So they brought them from guarding the mouth of the Nile to Alexandria to form a force against Julius Caesar. And they repaired 5 warships that were based in the vicinity of the royal dockyards of the type known as quinqueremes. So definitely in this case, there were warships based at the mouth of the Nile. Obviously, the Nile mouth were major stations of warships in the Ptolemaic period. And during that time, it's known that the Nile had between 5 or 7 branches, according to the testimonies, different testimonies. And the Nile was changing course as well in different periods. However, in places like Scadia and probably in Naucratis as well, there were bases for warships functioning there for reasonably sized warships like the triremes or Hemiolia. Yet, the larger and heavier ships must have been kept in the main harbor of Alexandria. How many warships was the harbor of Alexandria able to accommodate at that time? The underwater surveys that were carried out by the European Institute of Underwater Archaeology since the mid-1990s revealed a wealth of evidence on the formation of the submerged coastline and submerged harbor structure of Alexandria. The survey resulted in mapping the internal layout of the port, including the ancient quays and jetties, which formed a number of internal harbors within the main port. Accordingly, it became evident that the great... This is me? This is me? Okay. It became evident that the great port of Alexandria housed a number of internal harbors, which could have accommodated the Ptolemaic fleet. This, in fact, would lead us to talk about another issue, which was quite common in antiquity. It is the separation between military and commercial sections of harbors during the classical Hellenistic periods. As early as the 5th century BC, there was either a distinct, complete separation between military and commercial harbors, like the case of Piraeus in Greece or Carthage in Tunisia, where completely separated basins were dedicated for warships, and other basins were completely dedicated for merchant vessels. Or in other cases, there were separate sections within the same port, rather than 2 different harbors, like the case of Syracuse and the case of Alexandria. Of course, the main feature of military harbors in antiquity was ship sheds, where the warships were stored and maintained. Probably one of the best studied sites of that kind are the ship sheds of Zea Harbor in Piraeus, which have been studied for the past several years, and which the Athenian fleet was kept during the classical period. It is known from a number of sources that Zea Harbor contained 196 ship sheds, while the military harbor of Carthage, for example, contained 170 ship sheds, mostly triremes. So what we have here is the relative size of both Carthage and Zea compared to Alexandria, the harbor of Alexandria, the present size. Both together, Carthage and Zia, contained 366 warships. And comparing this to the size of the Eastern Harbor, obviously the Eastern Harbor can accommodate much more. However, that will entirely depend on the internal formation of the harbor and the quays. So if we keep in mind that a significant proportion of the fleet was kept on the Nile. Unlike the case of Piraeus again and Carthage, the eastern port of Alexandria was able to be used for both purposes, for a commercial purpose as well as for a military purpose during the Ptolemaic period. Yet there must have been some sort of internal separation between them in order to guarantee the security and safety of the fleet, of the navy. You cannot just put them all together. So looking at the layout of the port of Alexandria and the submerged harbor installation, it seems that the division of the port between commercial and military use is very feasible and it's very possible. This is again relative size of both Zia and Carthage compared to the internal submerged harbors of the eastern port of Alexandria. By looking at the distribution of archaeological remains recorded within the submerged inland harbors of Alexandria, we can see that there is a particular concentration. As you can see here, there's a particular concentration of remains, particularly of columns, around the shores of the first and largest internal harbor in the Alexandria port. Here we are particularly concerned with archaeological remains related to harbor structure, like ship sheds, for example, and columns are very much related to the construction of ship sheds. So paved quays and jetties, as well as columns, and particularly abundant in this area. So the first inner port had 1,200 meters of quays all around it. It had 1,200 meters of quays. The second port had about 800 meters of quays, and the third one has about 500 meters of submerged quays. However, much less archaeological remains are found on the shoreline of the second and third harbor. With that in mind, another feature which is quite clear in the first harbor is that it is easily controlled and secured, which is a main feature of military harbors in the Mediterranean. The harbor had two openings, controllable openings. The large one is about 80 meters and the smaller is about 30 meters. So how many ship sheds, again, could this harbor accommodate? Among the largest and the best documented ship sheds in the Mediterranean are the one in Zia. I mean, I love this drawing by my dear colleague Yanis Nakas. Unfortunately, he's not here, but I usually use it all the time. It has beautiful details. The largest ship shed recorded was in the Mediterranean in Zia was 54 meters by 5.7 meters. What concerns us here actually is the width of the ship shed. The length is not the issue, but the width of the ship shed is the issue. So according to the dimensions of the quay area or the jetty area of the first harbor and the width of the largest recorded ship sheds, we can safely say that the first internal harbor of Alexandria can accommodate at least 150 to 200 ship sheds. So just the first harbor can accommodate that much if we divide the area over the width of the maximum dimension of the ship shed. So going back to Athenaeus' list of ship sheds, of warships, we can conclude that out of the 310 that were retained in Alexandria, that were based in Egypt, 200 or 150 of them could have been housed in the first internal harbor only. While the rest, as I mentioned earlier, could have been based on the Nile. As about the royal ceremonial ships, which were only 7%, 7% is only 23 ships, can easily be accommodated on the other two ports, the second and the third one, which are very close to the royal quarters of Alexandria. However, the fourth internal harbor, this one here, which is this one there, the fourth internal harbor, which was located at the southern shore of the Faros Island next to the Hipta Stadium could have been used exclusively for trade or for merchant vessels. And this is, again, a separation, an internal separation between the military use and the commercial use. This was also facilitated with the link between the eastern and western harbors of Alexandria through the opening of the Hipta Stadium, which allowed the movement of merchant vessels between the two harbors. And from the western harbor and through the canal system, boats were able to move into the Nile system, either through smaller vessels or through merchant vessels that can actually go into the Nile. So from here, as you can see, merchant vessels can go into the other side of the harbor, down the canal system, all the way to the Nile, and this was probably dedicated to the commercial use. Obviously, the whole setup has changed completely under the Romans. Under the Roman rule of Egypt, the classis Alexandrina took over what was left of the Ptolemaic fleet, and the Potamophylakia took what was over of the Nile policing vessels, and the number and size of warships decreased significantly, and the internal harbors in the eastern port of Alexandria were mainly used entirely for commercial purposes. Under the Romans, Alexandria ceased to become a capital of an independent kingdom. However, her glory and uniqueness persisted and continued. Here I wish to quote just a short statement of the Roman orator Dio Christos about Alexandria in 102 AD. He says that, speaking to the people of Alexandria, and he says that not only have you the monopoly of the shipping of the entire Mediterranean, by the reason of the beauty of your harbors, the magnitude of your fleet, and the abundance and marketing of the products of every land, but also the outer waters that lie beyond are in your grasp, for Alexandria is situated, as it were, at the crossroads of the whole world. Thank you. Well, during the break, Alec Tilley will be presenting a poster about his theory of the design of warships in antiquity. If anyone is interested, I mean, this is a really very interesting discussion because he always have the argument about what is a warship in classical period, what's a trireme, what's a 50, what's a 20, and so on. So it will be during the break. Yeah. He's going to be here, yes. He's going to be putting a poster here, and we'll be around if you want to discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for 2 questions, no more, because we are late. So, are there any questions, please, to the speakers? May I kindly ask the lady or gentleman who is hitting his or her microphone to find out who is doing that, because it is really interrupting the hearing in the room. Yes, please.
Thank you, first of all, for the interesting talks. I would like to ask Professor Khalil regarding the Ptolemaic fleet. We know from inscriptions and from other ancient sources that Ptolemy II employed Callicrates from Samos as admiral of the fleet. Could you tell us a bit more about that? I mean, about the nature of the people that participating, or the structure, if we know anything more than this? Thank you.
Well, generally speaking, about either the Ptolemaic fleet or any fleet, you have to differentiate between two things. No, it's not. I can shout anyway. I used to lecturing. The actual soldier and sailors operating on warships that goes to war, this is something, and admirals who are managing the fleet is something else. It's completely different. And in this case, it was an admiral to manage the fleet rather than to operate, physically to operate the warships. And this is completely different. I mean, from the trial of the Olympias, I mean, we have Zallas here. And when they were doing the rowing trials, they used, university students, rowing clubs, and so on. And these could not ever give the same results as oarsmen who were actually born and trained to be oarsmen. So managing the fleet is something. And operating it's a completely different thing. And mostly you would rely on locals to operate the fleet. But you can definitely import, a manager to direct the Navy. So these are two different aspects, yeah, if I may say.
Thank you, Dr. Khalil. Last question. Thank you very much. There is a question. Yes, please.
There's only one question to Dr. Khalil. For the commercial harbor, did you correspond it with the topographical map of Alexandria? Because we know that the Empyrean is located there. It's corresponded with the Empyrean, or it's a little bit far away?
The Empyrean was located on land, on the terrestrial side. And there is something which I'm very sensitive about when we speak about the topography of Alexandria. Because many people, many scholars will speak about the topography of Hellenistic Alexandria as if it was yesterday. And they omit the fact that Alexandria was occupied by the Romans for a much longer period that it was occupied by the Ptolemies. And that the entire structure and the entire use of the harbor changed completely during the Roman period, completely. There was no need for royal harbors anymore. There was no need for a military fleet anymore. And the Neapolis, the new whatever it was, which was constructed in Alexandria, all this was done under the Romans. So the transaction that happened during the Roman period probably changed a lot of what we know about Hellenistic Alexandria, including Strabo's description, which was in 25 BC. So the Emporium was on land, definitely. But managing the merchant vessels coming in, which definitely also changed in terms of quantity and number and size of ships, the grain fleet in the Roman period, all this have changed the structure. So yeah, I mean, you can put the ships wherever you want, but the Emporium, according to what we know, was on land. But still, the eastern hub of Alexandria, under the Romans, I believe, was much more active than it was under the Ptolemies in terms of trade, at least. Thank you.
Okay, we have to adjourn, and we come back at noon. Those who wish to see the poster and discuss it, you can stay in the room here. Postpone your coffee break. Thank you.